So I've been trying to understand the Moscow drone strike and trying to make sure I understand clearly what happened. And I think I have a better handle on it, and we're going to try to review that now. So my question is, how did some people get it right and other people get it wrong? Now, if you don't know me, my name is Gerdes. I'm a professor. I try to help you understand context and analyze what's going on and think through things critically. And we're going to think through our assumptions here. So when we go back just 2 days, Vlad Vexler got it right, it seems. No, again, I'm saying it seems. I'm hedging a little bit, and I'm doing that intentionally. But I think he had it right. Let's hear Vlad for just 30 seconds.
Who could this be? I mean, So 50-50 is already suspicious, but I'm going to let you off the hook. And I'm certainly going to let you off the hook if you think there's a 20% chance that there's a false flag operation. But if you're saying there is a 99 or there is an 80% chance this is a false flag, then you are making something that is no longer a mistake, right? The fault is not anymore in the arguments for and against causality. It's in the deeper place. You've been swept up by something, right? There's something in you that's being pulled and baited, right? And you are becoming, as it were, a victim of a kind of pull or pressure. Now, much the same could have been said about the drone attack on the Kremlin. That's to say, it's completely reasonable to say it could be a false flag, right? But at the time that drone attack on the Kremlin happened, the people who said it was very probably a false flag attack indicated a lack of understanding of domestic Russian politics, right?
Okay, so let's just stop there. So he's saying definitely not a false flag, and he has reasons that he's thinking it. And he's saying if you're saying it's a false flag, it's because there's something in you that's seeing it. So and there's something very correct about that way of thinking. Let's listen to Anders Puck Nielsen. Now, Anders came out very strongly after the first drone strike, the one that hit the Kremlin, and talked about, hey, I don't think this is a false flag. Here's how false flag operations work, and I just don't see that, because if they did that, why aren't they doing this? And it was a good video to watch, but let's see what he has to say here.
That's what they say. The Ukrainians, of course, have not taken responsibility for hitting Moscow. So many people started speculating that this was a Russian false flag attack where Russia attacked itself to get some propaganda advantage. Maybe it could serve as a justification for another wave of mobilization or something like that. I don't think it was a false flag.
And a lot of good people thought so. Jake Broe came out and said, hey, this is another false flag operation, and here's why. And he laid out his case saying, look, how do you get through your Russian air defense? You have to go X number of miles. He's former Air Force, former missileer. He thinks in these kind of terms and categories. So there's a pretty compelling argument there.
Flag event. When there was the drone strike on the Kremlin about a month ago, I made another video where I went through some of the characteristics to look for when trying to figure out if something is a false flag operation. And I just, just as that time, I don't see any of those characteristics being present here. A false flag operation is an information operation. So it's something you do to get a propaganda advantage. And I feel pretty confident in saying that this drone attack on Moscow was not a Russian information operation, because at least in that case, they totally forgot about the information part of the operation. It has not been a big deal in the Russian media. In just a matter of hours, it disappeared as the top story in the Russian news. Putin came out with an improvised and pretty lame.
Now, that was one of the things that really grabbed my attention, because I was searching RT for it, and it was almost a non-story. And I found it to be very, very interesting that it was so muted, because if it was false flag, they'd be ginning it up. But it was hard to find stories about it that were actually had any meaning other than, well, this little bit happened and nothing really happened over here, right? I mean, that's what it came out to. It was really, really weird.
Statement where he told people not to worry and gave the impression that everything is under control. And then the case was sort of put into a committee that can investigate it, and quickly painters were rushed to the damaged buildings so they could cover up the damages. So this is not what a large-scale information operation looks like. I think one of the reasons that many people like this idea of a false flag operation is that they can't believe that the Russian air defense can be so bad that a drone can fly all the way from Ukraine to Moscow without being intercepted.
And
But
And that's really the trap, right? Because if we already have as a working assumption that the air defenses between Ukraine and Moscow are robust, then we've blocked ourselves from being able to see that as a possibility. And I think this is partly what happened, or largely what happened, to Jake Broe.
somewhat ironically, it seems to me that many of the people who now say that this was obviously a false flag operation, that they're the same people who also like to make fun of all the examples of military incompetence that we see among the Russians on the front line. So my response to that is no, they really are that bad. Like, the Russian air defense really is not capable of intercepting these drones before they reach Moscow.
And there's multiple reasons for that. They're not thinking that the Ukrainians are going to do that because the West is adamantly saying, don't attack Russia, don't attack Russia. So there's that, and they're bad, and there's corruption, and they're not thinking that they're going to do that anyway because the fight's really in Ukraine, and multiple reasons beyond that.
And that's actually the first reason why it makes sense for Ukraine to make these drone strikes. Like, I will mention two reasons in this video, but this is the first one. If Russia wants to improve the air defense of Moscow, then they will have to take that equipment from the front lines in Ukraine. Because Russia does not have like a pool of spare air defense that they can set up. And in practice, we can say that there are two things that Russia will need in order to intercept these drones. The first one is ground-based air defense systems. So that's systems like the S-300 or the S-400. And they need to be placed pretty close to Moscow so that they can defend the city. And then they will also need fighter aircraft that can intercept the drones during the transit between the Ukrainian border and the approaches to the city. So this area is so big that it cannot be covered by ground-based systems. So they will need to have a fighter aircraft on constant patrol over Russian territory. And then they will probably also need some airborne early warning aircraft like the A-50 that can discover these drones and guide the fighter aircraft. And all this will put a massive toll on the Russian Air Force that is already struggling.
And that's just for Moscow. Now think about this. What he just said, having all these defenses between Ukraine and Moscow is one thing. But now you do the same to Petersburg and this air base and that military base and this other place, right? So the argument that you hear from pro-Russian types are, well, Russia is so big. Somebody, some troll on in my comments yesterday talked about, well, Russia is 28 times the size of Ukraine, and he was talking about geographically, I'm pretty sure. And how could they possibly prevail or whatever? No, think about this. Now, Russia has to defend an area 28 times the size of the area of Ukraine with these fighter jets and with these air defenses. Otherwise, Ukraine can start to hit St. Petersburg and other places, this air base and that military base with impunity or the Russians have to pull all of their air defense artillery back in order to defend all these other places. And I think their size is going to work against them in a significant way in this regard.
To maintain the current level of operations in Ukraine. So this gives Putin an operational dilemma. Like, does he want to compromise the air defense along the front line in order to protect Moscow? Mm-hmm. Or is it more important to achieve the military goals in Ukraine? That's a real dilemma. And it is the first reason why it makes sense for Ukraine to attack Moscow. The second reason is that it undermines Putin's power base. Mm-hmm. It's a humiliation that he can't protect the country's capital, and it undermines the Russian propaganda network. The way the Russian media usually deals with bad news is that they silence it, or at least they drown it in other stories, so that it gives the impression that the bad news wasn't significant.
And
But
that's largely what I saw when I was looking at RT, and that's why I was thinking the way that I was. Okay, let's go, and you can watch the rest of this, and I highly urge you to watch the rest of Anders Puck Nielsen's drone strike on Moscow, taking the war into Russia. Please go and see that. I'll put the link in the pinned comment below. Here's Jake Broe's response.
Welcome back, Defenders. Jake here. Let's start today's video by following up on the drone attack on Moscow from 2 days ago. Now, 2 days ago, I didn't have all the facts. I assumed it was a Russian false flag attack.
Okay, now that's good, because he's correcting himself with new information, and that he's doing that is a very healthy, proper thing for him to be saying.
But that turns out not to be true. Ukraine was responsible for this drone attack. Putin says Ukrainian terrorist activity behind Moscow drone attack. Now, I don't support the Ukrainian military targeting any Russian civilians. In my opinion, there's plenty of valid military targets to be going after with these drones rather than targeting civilians. But that's not exactly what happened. Moscow hit by swarm of drones in wartime first. And according to the Russians, how many drones were there? There were 32 drones that made it to Moscow. Okay, how much damage did they do? How many civilians did they kill? According to the Russians, no casualties were reported. Nobody was injured, nobody was killed. So here's a picture of a drone that collided with an apartment building, and that's not a lot of damage for a drone to smash into a building because none of these drones had explosives on board.
Now, that leads to another understanding of assumptions. So if this was a drone attack filled with bombs or something along those lines, the Ukrainians don't tend to do that against civilians, right? But if it was just sending a political statement, that makes a lot more sense. So now we've moved away from false flag into either partisans or Ukrainians, and we're trying to make sense of this, and it does make more sense when you're thinking of it as a political statement.
So this wasn't meant to be a terrorist attack. Most of the damage seen on the internet was caused by Russia's air defense systems going off trying to shoot down all these drones. So in my mind, it didn't make any sense if Ukraine wanted to successfully strike things, why they would launch the drones during the daytime, when people can see them, they can film them. And it turns out that was the point. Ukraine launched a lot of drones without explosive capabilities in broad daylight so that the Russian people could see them. And these drones were flying over close to Putin's house. Down drones near Putin's residence rattles Russia's elites. And it's actually a neighborhood that the Ukrainians were targeting called Rublievka. I've never heard of this neighborhood before, but it's the unofficial name of a prestigious residential area in the western suburbs of Moscow. Many Russian government officials and successful business people reside in this gated community. So you can't buy property here unless you're part of basically Putin's inner circle.
Now, I'm going to leave that there with Jake. You can watch the other 24 minutes of that later on. I'll put that in the pinned comment below as well. But let's look at what Rublievka looks like. Zack the RUssian talked about this.
What neighborhoods of
Here he
Russia
goes.
were attacked? Well, that's a really... because, as we see, most of the missiles were flying directly to the elite neighborhood of Russia, to the place where Putin and all of his friends, they have houses. And this place is called Rublievka. Rublievka is a neighborhood or a county outside of Moscow, on the west of the Moscow, and is basically all of those small villages which are located and not far from the Rublev highway. And let me tell you what kind of people are actually living in Rublievka. For example, Gennady Timchenko, who is one of the best friends of Putin, and who is the owner of the bank, of the Russian elite bank named Russia. Also, Mikhail Mishustin, who is the Prime Minister of Russia. the ex-son-in-law of Putin, Kirill Shamalov, he has a house over there. The Minister of Defense of Russia, Sergei Shoigu, he has a house there. Arkady Rotenberg, who is a friend of Putin from the 90s, he was doing the judo in St. Petersburg with Putin in the same section. Also, Viktor Zolotov, who used to be a previously ex-security guard of Putin, and right now he is the head of federal agency of Rosguardia, which is technically made to fight protesters in Russia. And of course, Igor Sechin, who is a head of Rosneft, one of the biggest oil companies in the world. And of course, Putin. Putin himself, he has a residency in Novoogaryovo, and actually not far from his residency, about 3 kilometers away, the drone were shut down. Moscow Times, referring to some of the people close to Kremlin, said that Putin was woken up by the Presidential Service of Security and was leaded to the bunker in case there is going to be an attack on Novoogaryovo residency, where basically Putin lives for almost all the time. And eventually, yeah, Putin was woken up and he had to run to his bunker again in case there is going to be an attack and he's going to be assassinated this way. So it appeared that Rublevka's neighborhood, where all the elite people live, appeared to be the most secured neighborhood, and Moscow itself was not as secure as Rublevka, even though Rublevka was more close than Moscow. And yeah, all those other drones that were headed into the center of Moscow, they eventually were not shut down. They just crashed into the buildings. I guess because of the GPS were kind of shut down, and Ukrainians were not able to manage those.
So you would actually have a stronger argument that this was an assassination attempt on Putin in this missile or drone attack than you would in the first one on the Kremlin. It was actually closer to where Putin was. Okay, I just found that to be absolutely fascinating. And then finally, the last thing I want to show is this other clip from Zack the RUssian talking about this.
It's the Ministry of Defense of them not doing anything.
Why would you allow these drones to come to Moscow? The fact that they fly to your house in Rublevka and let your houses go up in flames, what do regular people do when drones with explosives crash into their windows?
But it's funny that Prigozhin is trying to build that picture as a real patriot of Russia. And
he's a real man of the people. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, I want to focus on Jake, because Jake is an interesting figure here. He gets a lot of things right, and he can see things that I can't see because of his background as a missileer. And I'm leaning on him with his, like, how could it possibly get through the air defense? Now, that made sense to me. And he especially is going to be prone to missing that. And that's because his background leads to a recognition heuristic, right? He's seeing things that somebody else might not see because of his military background, and that prevents him more strongly than it prevents some average person from seeing that the Russians actually were just that bad with their missile defense system. So that's really interesting. Now, my view personally, and I didn't say what my view was, the ISW, and I found this really interesting. The Institute for the Study of War, when they said this, they talked about the facts, but they didn't say whether it was Ukrainian or whether it was Russian or whether it was a false flag or whatever, but they were very muted about that. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Now, my view was that if it was a false flag, they would have made lots of propaganda noise. That's what I've seen. These are the patterns. This is my recognition heuristic. My view was that if it was Ukraine, it certainly would have been shot down, right? I mean, of course it would have been shot down. They couldn't be that bad. My view is that the Ukrainians also generally take credit for whatever they do, and they historically have. So that was part of what confounded mine in my recognition heuristic. My view was that Ukraine didn't want to do this because they didn't want to lose sympathy with the West, because if they're attacking, then it takes some of that away. But what if it was just to make the political statement and show we can actually do this, and you better back up your air defenses, right? So again, things got in the way. So I lean towards maybe it's partisans. Partisans have been active in other ways, and Ukraine doesn't attack these civilian targets, so that seemed to make up. But I didn't have enough information to actually make that case. And I'm not making that case now. But so where I lean, I couldn't say because I feel like I better back up what I'm saying here. And so I was very careful. Ukraine is in a very odd spot here, and none of the arguments, neither the Ukraine did it, nor the partisans, nor the false flag, seemed to completely line up. And so it was somewhat befuddling. But if they're sending a political message to the Russians and trying to get them to back up their air defense artillery, a lot of things make sense. Georgie pointed this out. I mean, he might be the most correct. Georgie from Ukraine Matters pointed out that they were going to this, trying to hit Rabluvka. So now the question is, how can I trust Jake? Well, I find him to be more trustworthy because he said this the other day with the facts that he had through the information as he sees it. And this is why it's important to triangulate, right? He sees it this way. Somebody else sees it this way. Somebody else sees this way. Generally, it's not that all one person is completely right, but if you triangulate, you can get a better sense of truth. He's generally right, but here where he made a mistake, he corrected himself. And that's really the important thing. He's more trustworthy when he corrects himself publicly. I've never seen RT do that. I mean, I don't know how much you read RT, but I've never seen, they're like, when they say something, they stick to it. Even when they said the day before the invasion, the Western powers keep blaming us and saying that we're going to invade. Well, that's just because they want to invade themselves. I showed this in another video, and then they invaded the next day. But they never corrected it. They never said, guys, egg on our face, we were wrong. Okay? So I think that's the difference here. Jake has a self-correcting mechanism. It's twofold. One, the audience expects truth and veracity, and you deserve truth and veracity. And second, he's willing to correct himself. So that's the important thing, and I think with the facts that we have uncovered since, my view of it is a lot clearer, his view is clearer, and he's been willing to do that. There's an interesting line in a book called Images of Organization by Gareth Morgan. He said, a way of thinking is a way of not thinking. And if you understand that, the way that you naturally see things can lead you to false conclusions that somebody else might not see because you have a certain way of thinking. Look, we might all be wrong. And this is why humility is important. And it's important to listen to other people and try to get a sense of what's going on. Okay, that's what I wanted you to understand here as we're trying to piece together what happened with the Moscow drone strike. Thank you for the likes. I hope this was helpful. Thank you for the coffees. Thanks for the shares, the super thanks, the subscribes. Thank you for caring enough to be listening to me even now. And thank you most of all for caring about Ukraine. I'll be back tomorrow, and I hope you will be too.